Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook, and you can support the channel on Subscribestar, Locals, and Buy Me a Coffee. Today is episode 6 of the political commentary, where we are talking about education and its effect on the country as a whole. I'm joined again by Florian. Glad to have you back.
Glad to be here.
So, the first thing that needs to be stated is that the United States does not actually have an education system. What it does have is an indoctrination system. So the first thing we need to set up is if we look at education as a structured, ordered body of thought in the Western tradition, it always begins with the principles of reasoning correctly. So reasoning from a premise to a conclusion. That's in any logic textbook, you'll often have, in the introductory logic textbook, you'll often have a simple hypothetical syllogism which says all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And obviously education then has, if it's a river, there's rivulets where you look at specialized information for industry or the arts or the sciences or whatever. But that comes after you've established a foundation. And we can see this, how far we've fallen. If you look at the 1890 Kansas high school graduation exam, you can look at that online. Most people can't pass it. It's like, well, that was high school. And, that was over 100 years ago when people were actually taught things, right? So when you don't teach how to think, then what you are being taught is what to think, right? That's where we're at now. We're at the what to think stage. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One reason is, I'm sure people have heard before, the idea of mass industrial education in order to have a compliant workforce. But there's also the idea that, at least in the United States and more broadly the Western world, it was based on the Prussian model of education with Horace Mann, who was the conduit, which was also to instill loyalty to the state and create good soldiers. And so neither of those two things are what to think. They're both how to think and how to operate within this complex system. Now, of course, with the Industrial Revolution, in the advance of technology, some education must, of course, be dedicated to teaching people how to navigate this. Obviously, nobody would say you don't need to do that. But at the expense of everything else that came before, that's a real problem. And we're beginning to see this now in the country as a whole, because what we're having is a political crisis where we don't really have civil society. We don't really have the ability to have political solutions like, say, you might have had in electoral politics 100 years ago. And part of that is this is a key failure of education. We don't teach people how to think like, act like, or be a citizen. So if you go back to the Founding Fathers and read the Federalist Papers and other letters they wrote, they fully understood that you're not born with the capacity to be a citizen. You have to be trained. You have to be educated. And that's what used to be called the liberal arts education. And that was how you created a base for people to engage in politics. That's been completely gutted. The only place you're going to get anything close to a liberal arts education is if you intentionally do something very narrow, like study philosophy. You can get logic that way, but otherwise it won't be a part of your normal curriculum. But the problem is those liberal arts degrees don't really give you good paying jobs anymore. So people are less likely to voluntarily choose them. And since that isn't a part of the base curricula, you just don't get it. So now you have a bunch of people that are engaged in the political sphere, but don't know how to do it. So it's just kind of a mess. On the one hand, it makes them easier to control for the elites. But on the other hand, things are getting out of hand. And I think even the elites at some point are going to realize, hey, things are really out of hand. But, can you pump the brakes? Can you reframe all this? Well, not easily, not quickly. And this is where the education system, now also that's what we might call formal education. But then there's informal education, which is growing up in subcultures or learning through osmosis. And in a sense, when America had a monoculture 100 years ago, it wasn't a big deal. Sure, you could be an Italian growing up in the Bronx or, a Swedish immigrant growing up in South Dakota, or somebody growing up in the deep South or the Midwest, but you all still knew what an American was, and you had local dialects and food and some cultural variation, but not a whole lot, and you could still make it work. Now that's just become more and more amplified, more and more extreme, and even that kind of osmosis learning doesn't really help you fit into the communities that you grew up in, right? We see this with like millennials and Zoomers, and now even Gen A, that are just getting left behind because for whatever reason they weren't able to absorb the necessary knowledge, even in their own communities, in order to do this. So we have a complete breakdown in the educational process. Part of it is because the right doesn't believe in education; it just believes in defunding it, which that's not a solution. And the left solution is to double down on their insane and crazy social engineering policies. That's not going to work either. So it's like a bad education than no education. And it's like, well, those are both not ideal outcomes. And so that's broadly speaking where education is currently in this country. Florian.
Yeah, many good points. And I'm reminded back on what you said in your last podcast about the trans market. If you said in the beginning that the U.S. doesn't really have a true education system, and I was wondering whether the U.S. is whether the U.S. education system is commercialized. It probably is, and in that way, it would just be education would just be a long form sales letter, right? So people don't learn useful skills; they learn skills that make them better consumers, right? And it sounds like an old left-wing critic that I heard a lot in the 80s or 90s, but ironically, that's kind of true now. And you alluded to that in your past podcast about the conservatives don't realizing that capitalism allows trans issues to come to the forefront, and the left wing fails to see capitalism from the left wing side as well. Um, you also said the system doesn't teach how, but what to think. And I get to thinking which system is really interested in having the subjects know how to think. Even people like Hegel and other philosophers, um, they were basically, if I'm remembering correctly, they were at universities, but these universities were also thought of as institutions that served to preserve order in the state, right? You can say that was like self-explanatory to the people back then, but still, education has a purpose. It's not. I feel like education was never really had the purpose of teaching people really how to think, but how teaching people how to think had a good purpose in keeping the order in society. And maybe that's really as it should be, right? But the left wing idea of being this free spirit that's roaming around and learning interesting things, well, that has led to students getting in debt over theater arts major with a lesbian theater subculture and South American studies minor, right? Um, Aaron Clary had a book published a few years ago. It was called Useless: A Young Person's Guide to Choosing the Right Degree. And there was a nice anecdote he had in the beginning, and the anecdote was that all these students that came to him that basically had degrees like theater science, music science, art history, all these kind of like social sciences, all these kind of like woo-woo liberal arts degrees. So they had all these degrees, and then he also let them write down what people spend all their money for, right? And it was like for gas and going to the movies, maybe a few CDs, clothing, food, electricity, and these skills are not taught at university, but these are the skills mostly in demand. No matter how much the left wing wants to believe in a well-rounded education. So in a way, choosing a major that gives you a skill set is is the closest you can get to learning how to think. Those people may not talk much about philosophy, but if you talk to a tradesman, they're probably pretty adept at identifying how to think rather than what to think, right? So, so in a way, how to think, uh, if you learn trades, is the one way that's closest to where how is really useful for society, right? So, and you also talked about education being part of subcultures, I think has always been like that. Like Gutenberg inventing the printing press, and all of a sudden he could carry education out to the masses, right? Because now you could print books. People then weren't allowed to, or it was very hard to get a real education where you could read. And the church was kind of guarding, if I remember correctly, the primacy over the written word, over religious text, right? They would basically have these rooms in which scribes would be, and they would use handwriting to copy those Bibles and other religious texts. And normal people weren't supposed to read that, right? That's also one reason why you see in many cases you see like pictorials about medieval stories, like stories in the Bible. They were expressed in pictures, so that was a way to communicate the biblical stories to the normal peasants because they couldn't read, and so they would now have like a little comic basically showing them this biblical story, but they weren't really encouraged to learn reading by themselves. So I think there's always this interesting tension between the state doesn't really wanting the people knowing too much, I guess, and you need to have people. You have an ordered society, and you need to have people have useful skills, and that also means they learn how to think. And in a way, I feel that in the 19th century America, and maybe even beginning of 20th century America, that was still intact, right? People weren't interested in learning like what to think, but they learned how to think, how to make sense of things in their environment.
Yes. So, yeah, to your first point, why would which regimes want people to know how to think and which regimes don't? Well, obviously, autocratic regimes don't. That's obvious because if people start thinking, then maybe they'll think about a different way to organize society. They don't like that. At the very most, they want people to be able to do discrete tasks. So, you might want to educate someone just enough to do a specific task in society, but no more than necessary, right? But if we look at the Western tradition coming out of Athens, mostly, well, I mean, the pre-Socratics predate, the Athenian democracy. But the point is, though, if you have a government like that, then you do want people to be broadly educated because when they become participants in the political process and essentially vote on the proposals of the Athenian elected officials, if they don't know what's going, affairs of state, what's going on in Sparta or Persia or whatever, then yeah, like as you saw with Sicily, you can have a big disaster. So you do need to know. Also, if you're a frontier society like the early American Republic, right, the government just doesn't have the reach to do all of these things. It just doesn't, right? So if it doesn't have the reach and you have threats like the British and Indians and Mexicans and other things like that, you're going to want people that can solve these problems on their own without having to call in the federal government because, again, that would overtax what the government can do. Because at the time, it wasn't powerful enough or rich enough to actually do that. And then with the religious traditions, right? Well, from the point of view of the Protestant Reformation, it's obvious. You want people to be able to read the Bible and to be able to engage with the Word, right? Other traditions like the Catholics and the Orthodox, that's not as important. So as we saw historically in those countries, especially like in Russia and Spain and Latin America, a literate population was not encouraged. But ultimately, though, from the point of view of like statecraft or realpolitik, why do you want a literate population? You want people who can operate machines. In the Industrial Revolution, Germany and England and the United States were world leaders because they were highly literate populations. And because they were highly literate, they could read technical manuals, follow procedures. An illiterate population can't do that. Right? That's why the Soviet Union, besides its obvious propaganda roles, educated the people as well so they could actually operate machinery, because a peasant can't operate machinery without that. So these are all levels. And the problem is you have this trade-off with control. If you just want control and you create like a symbolic language, you have like stop signs and like little stick figures on bathroom doors, you lose a lot of specificity, and people just lose the ability to think and follow, or even to follow orders, right? It becomes too much, and then you have to deal with the opposite problem. And so these are all, depending on what you want in your society, right? These are all the different preferences and effects that can happen. But a properly educated person, though, in any age in the West, whether that would be an Athenian, a Roman, a medieval monk, an Enlightenment French philosophe, an American engineer, or a Soviet, citizen, was somebody that could reason through problems, because you had to be able to do that in order to operate machines, and then engage in statecraft. That's just what education meant. Now, if you don't have that, if you don't teach people how to think, then that's not education. That's indoctrination.
Yes, and in a way, the more advanced a society becomes, the more acquiring a skill set will lead to learning how to think, right? So very very simple. If you think about Western tradition coming out of the antique, and back then it was the desire to everyone be able to participate in the political dialogue or multilogue of the political process, right? And then you look at Prussian education, and you could say, well, they just want to have obedient citizens that know how to march. Well, but the military itself is also very solution oriented. So if you have someone who's very well versed in terms of if you have someone who's a very good soldier will also know very well how to think, because this guy needs to solve problems, right? Even on the lower level, right? He needs to know how to take care of his rifle. He needs to understand the basics of formation and everything, right? So these people aren't just, if you are in the military, you are not just, this doesn't mean, I think that's always transpired a bit from the left of the political spectrum. If you're in the military, you're not some dumb puppet who just marches to the authorities' tune. No, these people really have to know how to solve problems and how to get along. Military is very realistic in a way, right? So they won't have a well-rounded education, but they will know very well how to fix things. And if past states wanted to have a literate population to operate machinery, nowadays you want to have a population that is able to operate AI, right? You need these people, and there's always the problem of slack now more than ever, because in the past, and that's a costly process, you always had, I mean, the people that started in the mail room or were just at the post office, just putting a stamp on a letter and then moving a letter aside, that's all done by machines. But then you have a problem that you have a slack, which means a group of people in society that aren't really that intelligent to acquire skills, right? But they are good for forwarding letters, and that gives them a sense of purpose. And these jobs are gone. So these people will now end up in tent cities. And that becomes very costly. The deal in the past was that big corporations, they would still hire those people in sort of like menial labor roles. But this is gone because they all use AI, and now even the lower classes of middle management, they basically how do you say it? They basically let go. And we talked about it over the past days, and I can say it again for the audience that it's not so much that people that are just having an education, or that everyone who is going for mid management, it's not that they are all being replaced by AI. What's happening now is that the higher echelons and the senior leadership or senior management at companies, they are using AI to make the entry level positions obsolete. So basically, if you're just starting out to work, they are shutting the door in front of you, right? And so you basically have a huge problem in society with people that are excluded from participation. And thanks to AI, seems like the silent contract, the unwritten rules whereby the corporate world would offer jobs for people that are not not able to go to the highest positions, that contract is gone, and society has to find a solution for that. Because I mean, yeah, you can say, "Oh, there's a tent city, Mr. Mayor, just kick them out of our city." But eventually, you can't just vanish them, right? You need to find some way of education for these people, some way for these people to still participate in the societal process. And for that, it would be of interest for any government to have their citizens educated, because otherwise, these people are completely without any chance of getting anywhere, and that's very costly for society.
Yeah. So with regards to practical skills, now on the one hand, if you look at say like a mechanic or a plumber, and they sort of like work on a problem long enough, and they just sort of can intuitively solve it. That's not what I'm talking about, because that's not really transferable very well outside of their craft. So, for example, they often get taken in by lots of other things that fall outside of their profession. And that wouldn't happen if they were taught to think critically. They would be able to look at what someone says and be like, well, no, that's not that, or this isn't that, right? And so what the case you're talking about, like a tradesman, is someone who, from his own experience, which is narrow to that trade, not to the whole scope of human thought, can sort of rule of thumb it. Okay, that's sure, but that's different. That's not the same as knowing how to think, because part of the problem, this is a meta problem, not just for the country politically, right, but even on interpersonal relations. So it's down to the smallest level, and that is, people believe things that are just not true. And if they had been taught how to think and reason through conclusions, they would know this, and they just wouldn't believe them. And also, it allows you to engage with other people in what we might call a non-violent way to resolve a dispute or to get what you want. If I can reason with someone, that precludes the necessity to use violence, right? Or the necessity to use some other pressure in order to get that person to do what I want. When you don't have that, you end up having either, emoting, people are just emoting all the time, and you don't really get anywhere. It's just like, lights blinking and nothing happens, or people get violent. And we're beginning to see lots of both right now. We're seeing both a lot of light blinking, emoting on social media and on the street, but then also a lot of increasing amounts of violence. And so the issue then becomes, so the ultimate part of the problem is the cost of this. People don't fully appreciate, because it's been so long since we've had a population that was able to do this and appreciate reasoning correctly, not just being taught how to think. And so they lack even that point of reference. So I like to go to Sherlock Holmes, where Sir Arthur Conan Doyle illustrates the importance of clear thinking and reason with his fictional character Sherlock Holmes. And the idea is that there's just lots of, now he does forensics, basically, investigates crimes mostly, but the basic principle is, if you can't reason correctly, either as an individual or in the case of Scotland Yard, the police, there's just lots of problems in your life that you can't solve, and these become inscrutable. They just make your life harder overall. And there's a compounding effect, because if you don't deal with these problems or solve them, they then generate new ones. And you are also left exposed to new ones. And so this compounding effect is like imagine a giant weight placed on your shoulders. It just gets heavier and heavier. And that's because you can't solve these problems. And so from the point of view of control, that's good, because these people are too weighed down to threaten your control, right? But that's bad for most other people.
Yeah, now you get me thinking about when Sherlock Holmes basically teaches us how to think critically, and in a forensic way, but this is a good example where you can think critically. I mean, everybody loves detective stories. I think crime has never really left a desire. There's always people, always. I mean, any series that's about crime on Netflix or wherever, always a lot of people are watching that. It's very popular. It's throughout popular. So I was thinking that maybe detective stories are a way to get people more literate. Now, if we think about having comparing a Sherlock Holmes story with the modern crime stories, would people still have the sensitivities to pick that up and say, "Ah, yeah, what Sherlock Holmes said, that makes sense. Yeah, let's worry about the dog that didn't bark," and all these kind of things. Would people still be catching up on that, or is the public consciousness going a completely different way? And in addition to that, I remember growing up in Germany, where basically university is free. There's no tuition that you pay, and every city has 1, 2, 3 orchestras and lots of museums, and they're very basically free of use. And that led to a situation where you have like bus drivers. They basically know the basics about museum paintings, and they know about poets, and they know about German thinkers, and all that kind of thing, right? And that strikes me as the opposite to having a population of tradesmen that know how to rule of thumb it. Now, I would push gently back against that. I think tradesmen do know a lot more than just rule of thumb it, because if you have to solve many problems of like electricity or carpentry or plumbing, you get sort of in the mood where you're a good critical thinker. I think lots of tradesmen know more about the modern like people that leave university, liberal arts degrees. But I'm wondering whether that is still possible, whether people still have a general sensitivity to pick up critical thinking skills, or whether we'll have to like reset this a little bit with general education, because we have been inundated in this country, at least for like academia has taught people what to think and not how to think for generations now, right? So are we ever going to go back into a situation where academia teaches you how to think? I mean, I'm thinking about institutions like Thomas Aquinas College that give you a real good liberal arts degree, not like liberal arts, LGBTQ, lesbian, South American theater arts major or something like that. Like the classics, the works that are important for Western civilization and all that, and the truth and what's religion and what's spirituality. A liberal arts institution like that, they are far and few between, right? So I'm wondering whether we are even able to teach people to how to learn and not what to learn. And I want to put another disclaimer up. If I hear myself talking like that, that sounds extremely arrogant. But I don't want to say I don't want to say I know how to think, right? In contrast to what to think. I'm just trying to figure out whether we can turn back our education system, where it gives us a good classical education, teaches people how to think, and be in the tradition of Western philosophy, basically.
Well, there's a few things here, right? So the first one is, through osmosis, watching crime shows or reading Sherlock Holmes. Part of the problem today, right, is we're so inundated with noise. I don't just mean noise in the terms of the actual sound, but like signal distortion noise, where we have all of these distractions and symbols and things being thrown at us. People don't, find the time to find that quiet place and just think. And that's partly what Sherlock Holmes has to do, right? He's not always on the beat. He has to go back to his apartment and think things out, right? And so people don't do that anymore. They don't even know that they need to. So that will be an impediment, absolutely. Not inscrutable, but it would take intentional effort to reform your life that way. The other thing then is, could we teach people? I think it's a matter of will, really. The education just isn't. Well, there's another layer to this, which is a problem. Education in the terms of the end product, that's what we've been talking about. Partly that's just a matter of will. I'm sure some institution, if they had the will, could just hire the correct logicians and just have them teach high school students. I mean, I don't see why that couldn't be a part of a high school curricula again. It's just that there's no will for it right now. But the other thing then is the praxis of education. How does a teacher communicate ideas to the subject? And this is where we have had a complete breakdown in education on the other side, right? So let's look at Plato, right? Plato has, I forget the name of the dialogue, but he has a dialogue where he's teaching a slave philosophy. And that's where he explores the idea of reincarnation, recapitulation, the idea that there's already these built-in structures for learning, which he attributes to a past life. And what you do as a teacher back then, what Plato does is he through his intuitive, or Socrates in the dialogue, through his intuitive understanding, helps generate inside the mind of the slave, I think it's the Meno, inside the mind of the slave Meno, certain ideas. So it's not just that he's holding a sign up and saying, this sign represents this. He's generating within the consciousness of Meno a symbol. And that symbol is that discrete piece of philosophy that he's trying to get Meno to understand. And so that means you have to be emotionally attuned to your student so that you can get inside your student's head and then help your student generate this principle of intuition within himself so that he can then see it and own it, rather than just having a symbol external to him thrown at his face through some sort of operant conditioning. So the other problem is like B.F. Skinner, right? Everything is just operant conditioning. You're a robot, you're an animal. We're going to ring the bell and, make you salivate, and we're just going to pressure you in different ways. That's not education. That is conditioning. That's operant conditioning. And that's all education is these days. I can say from experience, when I went to school, nobody tried to get me to reason, to generate this image in my head of what they were trying to say. It was more like, again, the typical browbeating propaganda, all that stuff, right? And many teachers are not actually fit to be teachers because they lack the ability to make that emotional connection with the student. They cannot make that emotional connection, and they cannot leverage that to be a direct conduit to the mind of the student to get the idea that you need. And this is why I think, riffing off Platonism and C.S. Lewis, a true teacher is someone who is embodying the love of Eros. The love of Eros in the Platonic concept is far more than just erotic, sexual love. It's the love of God, the love of the good, the love of ideas, and that's what they call the higher Eros, and that's what a lot of the Platonic dialogues are about. And so what all of that has in common is a generative property. You're creating something, in this case, an idea, but you're generating an idea in the mind of the student, and that's just Platonism 101. That's just education 101. And that's how it's always been done until, 30 minutes ago, right? And then you have all these kids that are, quote, see, I think this is actually where ADHD and ADD comes from. It's not the kids that are the fault, it's the teachers. They keep browbeating you with these symbols, and they're just like, look, here's a sign, don't cross, or whatever, like a crossing. They're more like crossing guards than teachers, because they can't make that emotional connection with the student and then generate within the student's mind or consciousness this idea. And then what you do, once you know how to think properly and reason, okay, you then lead them along the yellow brick road of reason by pointing them just a little bit ahead, a little bit ahead, a little bit ahead. And you keep doing that iterative process until they've internalized and mastered that skill themselves. And we are so far from that today.
Yeah, good point. I think the B.F. Skinner-esque paradigm has been playing a huge role in society for decades now, right? And it also plays into these it's all operant conditioning, right? There's also this I forgot the Milgram experiment, and there's another experiment which I forgot, where they put students as like prisoners and guards in San Francisco, which was sort of halfway fraudulent in the way it has been done in an unethical way. But all these experiments and all the wisdom coming out of psychology or sociology has a lot of operant conditioning in there, right? So basically regarding people as a machine. And I think that's an outcome of managerialism, right? If you want to manage something, it's easiest if you, I mean, if managing machines is very easy, or managing machines is substantially more easy than, or substantially easier than managing real people, right? So I think this whole Skinner and other people have set up a paradigm that was very useful to many elements of the modern bureaucratic state, and that's why it was kind of allowed to fester and solidify. Yeah, I don't think there was a people thought that's now we need to think about people as machines, but it was the most attractive explanation. And when everyone says, "Yeah, you're right, that's the best explanation," nobody pushes back against that. Then it becomes the operant system of society, right? And that has wreaked a lot of havoc in school, right? Um, so especially since what I'm from my own experience, I studied biochemistry in Hanover, in Germany, in 1995. That's when I started, and we had some students that also studied biology and chemistry, two different subjects, and they didn't become uh, chemists or chemical engineers. They became teachers, and it always seemed like they chose this road because the normal curriculum was too rigorous for them. So it always seemed like they became teachers because they didn't trust themselves enough to take on the hard sciences. So they just did like a junior version of that as a teacher, and that's a very bad way of becoming a teacher. I thought back then already. You should have. I think teacher is a very difficult job, and it should be a smaller amount of people becoming teacher, and they should really know how to, where, as you said, how to put an idea into a student's mind. And that also means that you treat every student in a slightly different way, because some students are they want to be like micro controlled in a way. Other students are much more independent. So you need to be able to figure an individual way out for every student. And for that, you need to someone who is 100% dedicated to education. And it shouldn't be people that kind of like failed at becoming an engineer, and they're now teachers, or having failed at anything in life and they just study sociology and education, and then they can become a teacher. That shouldn't be the case, but that's often been the case. And I can only surmise that Skinner's ideas and related ideas have also played a big role in modern sociology. And so then it's all a self perpetuating circle, right? I think it's very good when you mentioned ADHD may be an outcome of modern teaching, because because that happens if you treat people like a machine. They become, if you have ADHD, just may just be that you are very open to many different experiences, and then somebody shuts you down and wants to put you in a certain scheme, and that's something you can absolutely not bear. By the way, this thinking also has led to many polls before elections being wrong, because people now in science also collect data in by thinking that the people they ask are just answering like a machine would, right? So it contributes. So Skinner's paradigm, operant conditioning, and all that, it was interesting to learn about that. There's very much truth to it, but it was used in society to make society more pliable, to make society easier to control, and it now comes back to haunt us, because now more and more the failures of that system come through, and people become dysfunctional, and the education exacerbated that whole paradigm further, and that's not good. And that's one reason why we have an educational problem nowadays.
Yes. I'll briefly weigh in on a question from Seamus O'Blaine. What do you think of the loss of intelligence to the relaxing of selection pressure? and the building of deleterious mutations. So this is, again, more of an argument that you'll see on the right, or the right in general, human biodiversity, the bell curve, all that stuff. That, I think, could be a contributing factor, but ultimately the problem here is that the mechanisms that used to be in place that would instill the ability to think into people are gone, right? That's the problem. Now, this could be a knock-on effect, which then is a feed back into the system and then further hurts the system. But to just briefly recast what I've said so that people know what modern education is: indoctrination and operant conditioning. The teacher does not, in fact, modern education doesn't even really accept the idea that the mind exists. People are just meat machines. And, that was true in the Soviet Union and China today, but it's also true in the US. I mean, they don't treat you as a being with a mind or a soul or a spirit. You're just a meat machine. And so you're to be programmed. And now you program people with symbols. And these symbols are, generated through the textbooks and the teacher training. And using operant conditioning, you seek to. So there's two ways you can get an idea inside of someone. So let's use an example of a subcutaneous injection under someone's skin. Maybe you want to chip some person to track them. You can then just shove the needle in under the skin and inject that tracking chip. That's what education is today. They're using this blunt force instrument to inject it inside of you, hoping it sticks. But if you were to ask them why they're doing it or how they're doing it or what does this mean, they couldn't tell you, because they themselves don't know, right? They're just manipulating symbols downstream of the people that designed our educational programs, right? The actual teacher, say at a K through 12 or a high school, but they wouldn't even know, right? So now that's one way to get an idea inside someone, but the problem is that person doesn't know why it's there and doesn't know what it's supposed to do. It's just there through this kind of raw act. Now, how is that different from real education? Well, real education is the idea that's generated inside the person is there's an understanding, there's a mind, and that mind can be perceived or analogized as a room with furnishings. That's what is in this. That's why you read Sherlock Holmes. Often my first introduction to this, even though it's an old classical idea, was in The Study of Scarlet, where he talks about the brain attic. And ideas represent furnishings. Now, ideally, every furnishing in the room ought to be there for a reason, and you ought to know what that reason is. If you do the subcutaneous injection, it's just there, and you don't know why it's there. And, you're Anakin Skywalker trying to take out the suicide self-destruct chip, while you're a slave, right? Because you don't want that there. But the teacher sees that brain attic in you because he sees it in himself. And then he, for lack of a better word, it's a metaphor, telepathically appears inside your brain attic and says, okay, hey, there needs to be stuff in here. We're going to put stuff in here. And here's what they are: these beliefs, these principles. And by helping the student focus on his mind in such a way as to envision that brain attic, you're now creating for lack of a better word, space for such ideas to go. And then you start, the first ideas that go in there, you don't give a reason because you have to start with something. But then you start giving reasons for new additions. And as you furnish the brain attic of the student with more furnishings, you get new additions. You can then say, well, I put this here because of this principle. And you just keep reasoning out. And when the student is educated enough, you can be like, well, look, those early beliefs that I told you just to accept on faith, I can give you a reason now why you should believe them. You just weren't capable yet because you were too young or too uninstructed, right? Now, what is the main difference between the two? Well, the main difference between the two is that one is based on how the teacher relates to the mind of the student. That's classical traditional education. And the second is modern education, is how the teacher relates to the body of the student by conditioning that student to behave in a certain way, by feeding symbols to that student like a machine, and then using the disciplinary power of the school to punish the child for not following the rules. And this is where you get a lot of ADHD and ADD, because that's an insane way to learn. Like, that, you should not have to learn that way. And you know, and of course that disproportionately hits boys, right? Because they're going to be like, well, why should I do that? Well, what's the reason, right? And then you're just going to have because I told you so. And then you don't get to go on recess because you got detention, right? So, but again, that's the key difference, and that's what separates classical education as a form of praxis from modern education.
Yeah, good points. I realized some other things when you said that to modern education people are just meat machines. That sounds demonic, right? I find it sounds demonic, because that's what demons are. If you're possessed by a demon, he basically uses your body as a meat suit, right? And in a way that people dismiss spirits and ghosts is, you know, you can say on one hand we are smarter now, we have science to show that the supernatural doesn't exist. But if you dismiss spirits and ghosts, it's just another way that you confirm that humans to you are just like moist robots. That's something that Scott Adams termed that phrase. Now, moist robots is such a convincing concept because everyone who has been in sales knows that you can always use specific triggers to get people to buy from you, right? Basically, sales is you have one story about your product, you adjust the story to the customer, and then the customer has some counter arguments. You rebut those counter arguments because you know they are coming, and then the customer buys because he doesn't have another counter argument against your rebuttals. And in a way that machine-like view on people, that does work in the majority of cases, right? A salesman doesn't need to sell something to everyone, but he is going to be able to sell something to the majority of people, or at least as many people he needs to make a living, right? So in a way, this materialist worldview does seem to work, at least on some people. But we may want to be careful how much we foster that, because if we abandon the spiritual plane, then we can't build a society that lasts in the future if we just see people as sort of like meat robots, right? In a way, Elon Musk's Neuralink has the same problem, right? So it's great. He puts electrodes in your brain and then basically can reactivate some functions. So people can basically they couldn't speak before. Now, thanks to Neuralink, they can they move a pointer on the screen. They can communicate with people. That's really great. But it's also just one way. It also sees people as just a biological machine, right? And Seamus O'Blaine talked about Zimbardo. That was the guy with the San Francisco prison experiment, and he said that Zimbardo also put electrodes into Bull's brain, right? That would be similar to Neuralink in a way. Basically, also botnets on X, they're like Neuralink Light, right? Because they also put messages into your mind. Propaganda works that way, right? Edward Bernays got people to convince people that cornflakes are a necessary ingredient of every solid breakfast. It was this best marketing trick anyone has ever pulled off, and people for long decades were just convinced there needs to be cornflakes on your table for breakfast, and later on muesli or oats or whatever. So it worked, right? But maybe education is there to help people avoid these traps, right? I think in a way you ask yourself, why do people have these? Why do ruling elites have the desire to see people like machines? You look back at MK Ultra and other programs of the CIA, which explicitly did research because they wanted to find out how they can manipulate masses of people. Why do you have that desire in the first place, right? Why, as a ruling class, you have that desire? And it comes back to there's a small 10-minute YouTube movie by Stefan Molyneux called "This Is Your Slavery" or "Escape from the Matrix," something like that. And it basically, his hypothesis is basically that slavery has always existed, but modern societies have realized that, if the slaves think they're doing what they do voluntarily, and they will actually choose their slavery, then that's a perfect solution. You can have like highly functioning slaves and still control people, right? That movie actually red pilled me when I watched it in 2014. So there's a little. I'm very fond of that movie, but yeah, you should just look Stefan Molyneux, The Matrix, and he explains it very succinctly. Which may be one solution, one reason why education has been failing to give people critical thinking skills, and it's more indoctrination and marketing than developing critical thinking skills.
Yeah. So there's a few important points I want to make here. So first of all, the reason why a lot of these marketing gimmicks work is because of the failure of education. So, for example, in the 19th century, caveat emptor, buyer beware, was a widely understood common sense rule of thumb for everybody in the United States when it came to buying goods from the merchant class. And then you read like literature, the old crone might bite the coin to see if it's painted lead or actually gold, because gold's going to be softer than lead, right? So there's all of these things that people used to know about how a salesman would try to put one over on you, but that information is no longer being effectively communicated. So on that level, people are very vulnerable to this. But there's another level in which they're vulnerable. So to the salesman and why the sales pitch seems to work. In the study in Scarlet, where Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, a study in Scarlet, where Sir Arthur Conan Doyle expresses the reasoning methods of Sherlock Holmes, what we would call forensics, he calls analytical reasoning, which is reasoning from an observed fact to the causal chain that created it. So obviously, you're a police investigator, you're a coroner, somebody's dead, you determine cause of death. That's reasoning analytically. The way that the salesman tricks you is he wants you to think that he's being sincere, and he wants you to think that he's talking to you like a friend, like somebody at the pub, like a family member. And if you were able to reason analytically, you'd be like, no. What I'm hearing you say is not coming from the place that you want me to think it is, right? People can't do that. So when it does happen, they think it's coming from the place that the person wants them to think it's coming from. But if they were trained to think analytically, they would be able to reason through that and be like, well, no, you're just trying to sell me something, and you're just using a gimmick, right? That's what. So it's a twofold failure of education. One, it's a kind of common sense praxis, biting the gold coin to see if it's painted lead or not, or being able to reason analytically, both of which undercut this. And then but so it becomes a problem where there's this feedback loop where it's like it just keeps feeding back in on itself. This problem that is compounding and compounding. I predict at some point there'll be a critical failure, and that will lead to the collapse of the civilization. Now, that is unless somebody takes radical steps preemptively before that to get education back on track. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it doesn't seem very likely at the moment.
Yeah, it reminds me of what. Oh man, I forgot his name. Owen Benjamin. What Owen Benjamin said, that much of the modern malaise is people expecting to get something for nothing, because there must have been a reason that people abandoned concepts like caveat emptor, and those were no longer communicated. Probably because the merchant class or the merchant products have been wildly successful for the U.S. or for the Western world, right? So they use that, and you can get people, you can become highly productive, right? And you can incentives goes through the roofs for people that for people that are thriving in capitalism. So this was probably one reason why people focus on that, pushing further and further on the narrative and abandoning the old adage to be careful with merchants, right? In a way, also it seems like almost when once the U.S. wanted to intervene globally, it needed to have more. It needed to have higher leverage in its business decisions. Needed to have more productive industry. It needed to be quickly switching to a wartime industry, for example. And all these kind of things only work if you have a very efficient merchant system in place, and that probably exacerbated the way of the U.S. in the 20th century. That would be one reason. I can also imagine that you know that that the merchant class, if you will, or that capitalism has been introduced more, and that marketing and branding have been more pushed to the forefront of society.
Yeah. So as we wrap the show up, I'll just say also this can be seen as kind of a sister show paired for the what's coming up on Saturday for the Roundtable, where with Keith and Alec we will also be talking about education. There's just a lot to talk about, and it's a really important issue. So we're having a this sort of ongoing conversation about this. And for those people that didn't actually get an education, the best place to just start is just read Sherlock Holmes and start reading detective stories. Because the first problem is you don't even have your brain or your mind wired correctly to think that way. That's why when you read these stories to children, or when children read or young adults read them themselves, it sort of intuitively wires the brain to think that way, without you even having to try, right? Because stories are just powerful, right? So that's my final thoughts, Florian.
Yeah. Okay. So how do we get back to a really well-rounded education, to really giving knowledge to people, to really not just indoctrinate people and so on? Um, it seems to me there's two possibilities. A would be a cataclysm of some sort. There was TV show. It was called Evolution, I think. Yeah, and the backstory was that at one day electricity is just gone. Electricity is wiped off the earth, and so everything that was working, computers, um, uh, you know, uh, lights on, communication was just gone. And the U.S. starts to separate into several factions. Of course, you can imagine you get civil war like reality, and then you have like four or five different territories that happen there. And that means people need to in such a situation, people will be cut off of any commercialized um, uh, any advertisement, any marketing, any branding. That's pretty much gone because it relies on electricity, and people have to come back to make their own, to construct their own world. And so, in that way, um, teaching people how to think could become important again, right? Because now all of a sudden you really have to think: what happens to the United States? What happens to the world? How are we doing society now? And so on and so forth. And the other little less harmful way is stories. Yeah, I'm glad that Todd just mentioned that. Stories is one way. If you teach children the right stories, then you can basically fight back indoctrination. And it's not easy because there was a tweet by someone who was thinking about buying a child some book, right, a 2-year-old, and there's already pro-trans LGBTQ books. There's like the whole propaganda is already on for like 1 or 2 year olds, which makes sense, right? You want to indoctrinate children as early as possible, and so that's also dangerous for storytelling. If you're not really aware what stories there are, what stories you should tell, you might think, oh, this is a book. Oh, it's called Baby Can Be Bi. Huh. I wonder, that might be a good book for my child. And so then you basically already fall into the trap. But in general, storytelling is another good way to exdoctrinate people.
That's right. Well, thank you, Florian. It's always a pleasure having you on.
Thanks for having me.
This is Todd Lewis of the President Flight Podcast signing off.